A corrupt cop assaults a young black woman, thinking he can get away with it, until he learns she's Big Shaq's daughter. The police try to cover it up, but Shaq doesn't play by their rules. He flips the system against itself. When the truth comes out, careers crumble, secrets unravel, and the country watches justice hit hard. Stay till the end, because this isn't just a fight, it's a reckoning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The sun was just beginning to set over Brookhaven, a quiet, upper-class neighborhood where the streets were lined with pristine houses, manicured lawns, and a false sense of peace. Savannah Dorsey, 21 years old, sharp-minded, confident, and the daughter of Big Shaq, had just finished grabbing coffee with a friend. She was driving home, music playing softly, her hands relaxed on the steering wheel of her sleek black Audi A7, a gift from her father for making Dean's List. Then, flashing red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. A sigh escaped her lips. Another traffic stop. She wasn't speeding, she wasn't swerving. She had done nothing wrong. Yet, here she was. Again. She pulled over smoothly, keeping her hands on the wheel, just like her father taught her. Through the side mirror, she saw a tall, heavy-set officer step out of his squad car. Officer Chadwick Grayson, a name she'd heard before. A cop with a reputation, but not for protecting people. Her pulse spiked. Grayson adjusted his belt, resting his hand on his holstered gun as he approached the driver's side. He leaned down, his face a mask of forced authority. License and registration. Savannah's hands remained visible. "Of course, officer," she said, keeping her voice calm. "Can I ask why I was pulled over?" Grayson's lip curled. "You were driving a little too nice for my liking," he said, tilting his head. "Figured I'd check things out." Savannah's stomach tightened. This wasn't about a traffic violation. This was something else. But she wouldn't let him rattle her. She handed over her license and registration, her fingers steady. Grayson barely looked at them. Instead, his eyes scanned the interior of her car, like he was searching for an excuse. "You got anything in here I should know about?" he asked, his tone dripping with fake politeness. Savannah frowned. "No, sir." Grayson's jaw ticked. "You mind stepping out of the vehicle?" Savannah's breath caught. She knew she had rights. She hadn't broken any laws. But refusing, that could turn ugly fast. She unbuckled her seatbelt, stepped out carefully, hands visible. Around them, a few bystanders had started watching. A man across the street had his phone out recording. Grayson saw it too, and it pissed him off. His patience snapped. "You want to act tough?" he sneered. "Think your rich daddy's gonna save you?" Savannah's heart pounded, but she held her ground. "I don't need saving," she said firmly. "I just need you to do your job right." That was it. That was all it took. In a blur, Grayson grabbed her by the arm, yanking her forward. Savannah stumbled, gasping. The crowd gasped too. Then, his hand snapped out, and in a single shocking moment he struck her across the face. The hit wasn't hard enough to knock her down, but it wasn't meant to be. It was meant to humiliate. It was meant to put her in her place. Savannah's face burned, not just from the slap, but from the raw humiliation of it. She heard a woman shout in disbelief. "He just hit her!" Another voice, closer. "Dude, I got the whole thing on video." Grayson turned sharply, realizing his mistake. He had let his arrogance slip. And now, the evidence was everywhere. Savannah didn't cry. She didn't break down. She simply took a deep breath, reached into her pocket, and called the one person who could end this. Her father. The call barely rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Pumpkin?" She exhaled shakily. "Dad." That was all she had to say. The silence on the other end was deafening. Then, his voice came through lower this time. "Where are you?" Savannah swallowed. "Brookhaven. Near the... I'm on my way." Click. The call ended. The street had filled with people now. A handful of officers had arrived as backup, trying to control the situation. But it wasn't working. The video was already online. Grayson looked nervous now. And then, a sleek, matte black Cadillac Escalade pulled up to the curb. Slow, calculated, dangerous. The door opened, and Big Shaq stepped out. The crowd instinctively stepped back. Dressed in a tailored black overcoat, dark sunglasses, and an expression carved from stone, he barely glanced at anyone, his eyes locked on one person only: Officer Chadwick Grayson. The entire energy of the street shifted. Power had just changed hands. Shaq didn't rush. He didn't yell. He simply walked toward his daughter, placed a steady hand on her shoulder, and looked her over. His jaw ticked as he saw the faint red mark on her cheek. Savannah met his gaze. She was fine, but that wasn't the point. That was never the point. Shaq exhaled slowly, then finally turned his gaze to Grayson. The cop straightened, forcing a smirk. "Sir, Shaq held up a hand. Grayson shut up immediately. The crowd was silent now, because everyone could feel it. The storm was coming. Shaq adjusted his coat, slipping his hands into his pockets. Then he spoke. "Tell me exactly what happened, officer." Grayson stiffened. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Because for the first time in his career, he was afraid, and rightfully so. Because when Shaq fights back, he doesn't just hit, he destroys. Brookhaven's police department was built on silence. It had survived scandals, lawsuits, and public outrage, not because it was innocent, but because it knew how to bury the truth before it could breathe. And tonight, it had one more mess to clean up. A racist cop caught on camera, a battered young black woman with a powerful father, a story that was already slipping out of their control. But Chief Harold Whitmore, a man who had spent 30 years keeping his officers protected, no matter what they did, wasn't about to let one viral video bring his empire down. Not if he could help it. Inside the station, Officer Chadwick Grayson sat stiffly across from his captain. His lip twitched with anger, his fingers drumming against the metal desk. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "She was resisting. She was disrespectful. And I only used force because she—" Whitmore held up a hand. Grayson shut up. "Here's what we're going to do," Whitmore said coolly. "We get ahead of the story. Control the narrative. Make it look like this was justified." He leaned forward, his eyes sharp and unreadable. "You were dealing with a hostile suspect. She was resisting arrest. You had no choice but to defend yourself." Grayson nodded immediately, his confidence returning now that the department had his back. "I'll say she was yelling, refusing to comply," Grayson said quickly, "and that I had to restrain her." Whitmore smirked slightly. "Good, and I'll make sure the press gets that version first." The cover-up had begun. By morning, the first news reports were out. Local Channel 9. Officer defends himself against unruly driver. Was he just doing his job? National News Network. Brookhaven cop under investigation after viral video shows unprovoked assault on college student. The same story. Two different versions. Some outlets ran with the police department's narrative, repeating Grayson's false claims that Savannah had been aggressive, out of control, and uncooperative. Others, especially independent journalists, weren't buying it, because the video didn't lie. And now, the whole country was watching. While the world exploded with opinions, one voice was noticeably absent. Shaq. He hadn't given a statement, hadn't done an interview, hadn't made a single public move. And that's what made the Brookhaven police nervous, because they knew a man like Shaq wasn't just waiting, he was preparing. Inside his private office, Shaq stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline. His jaw was tight, his hands clasped together. Then, he picked up his phone and made the first call. Maxwell Kane, the most ruthless civil rights attorney in the country. "I need you on this." "Already on it," Maxwell responded smoothly. "We're going to destroy them." Click. The second call. Elise Montgomery, an investigative journalist known for ripping apart corrupt institutions. "I want the full history on Officer Grayson, everything. Give me 24 hours. Click. The third call. Senator Fields, a powerful politician who owed Shaq more than one favor. "They're trying to cover it up. I need pressure from above. Say no more." Click. Shaq set the phone down. His face remained unreadable. He wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. But that was the most dangerous part. Because when Shaq fights back, he doesn't just win. He makes sure you never get up again. By the next morning, the pressure was closing in. Grayson walked into the station, expecting business as usual. Instead, whispers followed him. Officers huddled in small groups, their eyes flickering toward him before quickly looking away. Something was wrong. Then, his captain called him into the office. Grayson stepped in, expecting another strategy session. But instead, Whitmore's face was tight with frustration. "We have a problem," he muttered. He tossed a folder onto the desk. Grayson's stomach sank as he opened it. Inside, printed screenshots, reports, and documents. His complaints, his misconduct records, his history of racial profiling. And worst of all, a list of other victims now coming forward. "This is a damn witch hunt," Grayson snapped. "I did nothing wrong." Whitmore leaned forward. "You better hope we can still contain this," he hissed. Because if this keeps growing, he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to, because they both knew what happened when public outrage reached the point of no return, and Big Shaq was making sure they got there. That night, everything boiled over. The leaked footage was all over national news. Grayson's history was trending on Twitter. The police department was under federal review. And then, Shaq finally made his move. A single statement, simple, director, and lethal. "This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every person who's been silenced. Not this time. Not anymore." It was everywhere within minutes. The pressure was now suffocating. Sponsors started dropping their support for the Brookhaven PD. Protests started forming outside the station. And behind closed doors, even the police chief knew it was over. They had tried to cover up the truth, but Shaq had set it on fire. And soon, Officer Grayson wouldn't just be exposed, he'd be erased. Brookhaven's police department had gotten away with a lot over the years. Complaints disappeared, reports were altered, victims were silenced. But this time, they weren't just up against anyone. They were up against Big Shaq. And he wasn't here to beg for justice, he was here to take it. Most people, after seeing their daughter assaulted by a corrupt cop, would have raged, protested, or demanded a meeting with the police chief. But Shaq didn't waste time with people who weren't in control. He went higher. The phone call was made in less than 10 seconds. "Maxwell, time to get to work." Maxwell Kane had one rule when he took on a case. "I don't fight fair. I fight to win." And that's exactly why Shaq called him. Tall, lean, and dressed in a dark gray suit that cost more than a squad car, Maxwell Kane had made a career out of bringing corrupt law enforcement to its knees. The moment the case hit his desk, he saw the cracks in the police department's cover-up. The official report? Full of contradictions. Grayson's history? Filthy. And worst of all, the department was still trying to protect him. Maxwell smirked as he flipped through the files. "Yeah," he muttered. "This is going to be fun." By noon the next day, Maxwell had already sent a formal legal notice to the Brookhaven Police Department. It wasn't a request. It was a declaration of war. Every single body cam recording from that night, we want it. Every misconduct complaint against Officer Grayson, handed over. Every internal email regarding this case, subpoenaed. The department tried to push back, delay, and stall. But Maxwell, he was already 2 steps ahead. While Maxwell handled the legal destruction, Shaq made his second power move. He called Elise Montgomery, a high-profile journalist with a reputation for taking down corrupt institutions. Elise had exposed police scandals before. But this was bigger. When she received the leaked footage of Savannah's assault, she knew exactly what to do. Within hours, the video was everywhere. National headlines exploded. Brookhaven cop caught on camera, a clear case of police brutality. Daughter of billionaire Shaq Dorsey, assaulted by officer, and the cover-up begins. How many more? Corrupt cop's history of abuse. Finally exposed. Cable news ran the story on repeat. Social media erupted with outrage. And in the middle of it all, the Brookhaven police chief was drowning in damage control. Chief Harold Whitmore had seen bad days before. But this was a disaster. The press was outside his office. His phone was ringing nonstop. City officials were demanding answers. And worst of all, Shaq still hadn't said a word, because the most dangerous man in a fight is the one who doesn't even look worried. For the first time, Chadwick Grayson felt fear. Yesterday, he had walked into the precinct smug and untouchable. Today, he walked into stares, whispers, and officers distancing themselves from him. Because everyone knew what was coming, and no one wanted to go down with him. Even his union rep, the same guy who had always covered for him, sounded different this time. They're looking for a scapegoat, Grayson, and right now, that's you. Grayson's hands curled into fists. This is a damn setup, he hissed. That kid, she was being aggressive. The union rep sighed heavily. Did you forget there's a video, Chad? Grayson's heart pounded, because no matter how many lies he told, the camera didn't lie. By the end of the day, Brookhaven PD was out of options. The mayor had been dragged into the mess. The governor's office was watching closely, and the FBI had been contacted for a possible civil rights investigation. Then, Shaq made his first and only public statement. A simple, deadly tweet. This isn't just about my daughter. This is about every person who's been silenced. Not this time, not anymore. The impact? Nuclear. The tweet had 1 million likes in an hour. The hashtag #Justice for Savannah was trending worldwide. Celebrities, politicians, and activists rallied behind Shaq. And the final blow? Shaq's legal team officially filed a civil lawsuit, not just against Officer Grayson, but against the entire Brookhaven Police Department. Because this was never just about one corrupt cop. It was about an entire system that had protected him. But not anymore. Grayson felt it now. The walls closing in. The people turning against him. The system that once protected him was now looking for an exit strategy. And he was that exit. Meanwhile, Shaq, he was still calm, controlled, unshaken, because he knew the game was already won. He didn't just fight back. He flipped the entire system against itself. And soon, Grayson wouldn't just lose his badge, he'd lose everything. Officer Chadwick Grayson had always believed in one simple truth. The system was built to protect men like him. For years, he had skated past complaints, internal investigations, and eyewitness reports, each one vanishing before it could do real damage. A shove here, a fabricated charge there, a well-placed call to the union, a favor from a superior. It had always worked. But now the system wasn't shielding him. It was stripping him down, piece by piece. And this time, there was nowhere left to hide. The Brookhaven Police Department had barely caught its breath from the media backlash before the floodgates burst open. Anonymous reports, old, forgotten cases, body cam footage that was never supposed to see the light of day. And at the center of it all, Officer Chadwick Grayson. The first victim to come forward was a schoolteacher, a woman who had been pulled over late at night and falsely arrested when she questioned why she was stopped. Then came a teenage boy, now an adult, who recounted the time Grayson had forced him face down on the pavement for looking suspicious. A single mother shared how he had intimidated her into dropping a complaint after he searched her car without cause. One story turned into 3. 3 turned into 10. 10 turned into a movement. And every single one of them had the same pattern. Racial profiling, abuse of power, a complete lack of accountability. Grayson's file, once locked away in police archives, was now being dissected on live television. And for the first time in his life, he was the one under interrogation. While the victims were stepping forward, investigators were digging deeper. Shaq's legal team had been relentless. Subpoenas, leaked documents, whistleblowers within the department. And what did they find? It was worse than anyone expected. Body cam footage from past arrests showed Grayson using excessive force, even when there was no resistance. Internal memos revealed that complaints against him had been dismissed without investigation. Emails between officers casually joked about how Grayson handled things his way. And the most damning piece? A recorded phone call between Grayson and a superior, where he openly admitted to lying on police reports to justify his actions. The recording was played on national television. Grayson's voice, calm, cocky, untouchable. You think anyone's gonna question me. They never do. It was the moment his downfall became inevitable. Brookhaven PD had covered Grayson too many times to count. But now, there were too many eyes watching. They tried to distance themselves, claiming that his actions were isolated incidents that didn't reflect the department's values. They tried deflecting, saying they would conduct a thorough internal investigation. But no one was buying it. Not when Shaq's legal team was already pushing for a full federal probe. Not when journalists were digging into how deep the corruption actually went. And not when the public had already made up its mind. A week ago, he had been arrogant, smug, convinced this would blow over. Now, he could barely show his face in the precinct. Officers who once had his back avoided eye contact. Superiors who once defended him stopped returning his calls. The police union, his last line of defense, was starting to waver. And then came the final blow. His badge and gun were taken, placed in a small plastic evidence bag. Administrative leave, they called it. But Grayson knew the truth. He wasn't coming back from this. Shaq could have celebrated, could have sat back and let the world tear Grayson apart. But he wasn't just after one cop. He was after the entire system that let him thrive. And so, the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Shaq made one more phone call, not to the media, not to his lawyers, but to a U.S. senator. This isn't about one officer. This is about every damn one they covered for. The message was clear. Shaq wasn't just taking down Grayson. He was taking down everyone who let him exist. And once he was done, Brookhaven's entire police force would never be the same again. The air inside the packed courtroom was thick with tension. This wasn't just another trial. It was a reckoning. Officer Chadwick Grayson walked in with the same smugness he had carried his entire career, dressed in a neatly pressed suit, his expression carefully measured. To him, this was just another battle to survive. He had seen officers walk away from worse. A little media firestorm? It would pass. A trial? That could be controlled. But as he took his seat at the defense table, he made the mistake of glancing at the other side of the room. Shaq was already there. And he wasn't alone. Seated beside him, dressed in a crisp, charcoal gray suit, was Maxwell Cain, the most feared civil rights attorney in the country. The man who had built his career by exposing the exact kind of corruption that Grayson had benefited from for years. The man who never took a case unless he was certain he would win. Grayson forced himself to look away, but the weight in his chest had already settled in. Something felt different this time. And then the trial began. The prosecutor, a seasoned but nervous attorney named Michael Jennings, stepped forward first, painting the scene exactly the way the Brookhaven Police Department wanted it remembered. Officer Grayson was acting within the bounds of his duty, he argued. The suspect. He stopped, realizing too late that calling Savannah a suspect in a courtroom filled with reporters wasn't a good look. He quickly corrected himself. Miss Dorsey failed to comply with lawful orders, leading to an unfortunate but necessary escalation. The jury remained still, unmoved. Jennings shifted uncomfortably. He was trying to play it safe, but the problem was, this wasn't a safe case. There was video evidence. There were witnesses. And sitting just 20 feet away was Shaq Dorsey, a man who wasn't just fighting for his daughter, but for something much bigger. Jennings tried to push forward. We ask the jury to consider the difficult position officers find themselves in every day. Officer Grayson had to make a split-second decision in a high-tension situation. Objection, Maxwell Cain said, his voice smooth but sharp. Is the prosecution suggesting that striking a young woman in the face was a split-second decision? The judge glanced at Jennings. Sustained. Stay on track, counselor. Jennings clenched his jaw, knowing he had already lost control of the argument, and they weren't even halfway through. When Maxwell Cain stood, the energy in the room shifted entirely. He didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to make dramatic gestures. All he had to do was speak, and the room belonged to him. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, he began, his voice even and commanding, you have been presented with an argument that asks you to ignore what you saw with your own eyes. That asks you to believe that a young woman, who was calm, compliant, and entirely within her rights, somehow deserved to be assaulted by a man with a badge. He turned and faced the jury directly. Now, if there was no video, maybe they could sell you that story. Maybe we wouldn't be sitting here today. Maybe Savannah Dorsey would be just another name in a forgotten police report, another victim who never got justice. But we do have a video. The screen at the front of the courtroom flickered, and the footage played. The moment Officer Grayson yanked Savannah out of the car, the moment he raised his hand, the moment he struck her, and then the moment he realized he had been caught. The courtroom was silent. Maxwell let it sit for a few seconds before he continued. That is not a split-second decision. That is not a mistake. That is the act of a man who believed he was untouchable. Jennings shifted uncomfortably, knowing there was no argument strong enough to counter what they had just seen. Grayson, for the first time, looked truly uneasy, and it was about to get worse. Savannah Dorsey had spent the last few weeks in the public spotlight, but this was different. This was the moment she would have to speak her truth in front of a room full of strangers, in front of the man who had tried to humiliate her. She took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Miss Dorsey," Maxwell began gently, "I know this is difficult, but can you walk us through what happened that night?" Savannah nodded, her voice clear, strong. "I was driving home after meeting a friend. I wasn't speeding. I wasn't breaking any laws. But when I saw the lights behind me, I pulled over because I knew." She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "I knew that as a black woman, I had to be extra careful." A murmur rippled through the audience. "Why did you feel that way?" Maxwell pressed. "Because this isn't the first time something like this has happened to me," she admitted. "Or to people I know. I've been taught since I was a child to keep my hands visible, to speak calmly, to move slowly, because even when we do everything right, things still go wrong." Maxwell nodded. "And what happened next?" Savannah swallowed, but she never broke eye contact with the jury. "Officer Grayson asked for my license and registration. I gave it to him. He asked if I had anything in my car. I told him no. Then he told me to step out of the vehicle." "And did you resist?" "No." "Did you argue?" "No." "What happened next?" Savannah exhaled slowly. "He grabbed me, pulled me out of my car, and when I asked what I had done wrong, he hit me." A beat of silence passed through the courtroom. Maxwell turned to the jury. "And what reason did Officer Grayson give for hitting you?" Savannah's voice didn't shake, but it was laced with quiet anger. "He never gave one." The prosecution didn't even bother with cross-examination. By the time the jury was sent to deliberate, the outcome was already written. They didn't take long. When they returned, the four persons stood, clearing their throat. "On the charge of excessive use of force, guilty." Grayson didn't react. "On the charge of filing a false police report, guilty." A slight shift in his breathing. "On the charge of civil rights violations, guilty." It was over. Grayson sat motionless, his hands clenched into fists. He had spent his whole life believing there were no real consequences for men like him. But now, he would lose his badge, his freedom, and his reputation. Maxwell Cain leaned toward Shaq and murmured, "Checkmate." Shaq didn't smile. Because for him, this wasn't a victory. This was something that should have never happened in the first place. And now, it was time for the world to hear exactly what he had to say. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that felt empty, but the kind that carried weight. The kind that pressed against the walls, against the chests of everyone in the room. The kind that came right before something irreversible happened. Chadwick Grayson sat at the defense table, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the edge of his chair. He was still trying to convince himself there was a way out of this. Maybe the jury would hesitate. Maybe they would see him as just another officer forced to make a tough decision. Maybe, despite everything, the system that had protected him for so long would save him one last time. But then, the jury four-person stood. The judge gave a slow nod, motioning for them to read the verdict. And Grayson knew. It was over. On the charge of excessive use of force, we find the defendant guilty. The words hit the room like a bullet. A murmur rippled through the audience, some gasping, others barely breathing. Grayson's face remained stone, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. On the charge of falsifying a police report, we find the defendant guilty. His grip on the chair tightened. On the charge of violating the civil rights of Savannah Dorsey, we find the defendant guilty. For the first time in his life, Chadwick Grayson felt what it was like to lose. The judge's gavel slammed down, sealing his fate. A landmark ruling. A ruling that wouldn't just affect Grayson, but every officer who had ever thought they were untouchable. And Shaq? Shaq didn't move, didn't smile, didn't celebrate. Because this wasn't a victory. This was justice, long overdue, but still not enough. Before Grayson could even process what had happened, another storm was already brewing. The press had exploded. Social media was on fire. Every major news outlet had the verdict on their front page. Talk shows, journalists, politicians, everyone was talking about what just happened. But the real damage, it wasn't just to Grayson, it was to everyone who had protected him. The Brookhaven Police Department was in full meltdown mode. Reporters were digging through every complaint ever filed against their officers. A full federal investigation was announced just hours after the verdict. The police chief, the same man who had tried to bury the case, was now under pressure to resign. And then, he did. A formal statement was issued the next morning. After careful consideration, Chief Harold Whitmore has chosen to step down from his position effective immediately. It wasn't a careful consideration, it was survival, because Whitmore knew if he didn't leave on his own, he'd be dragged out, and he wasn't the only one scrambling. Several officers were suddenly under review. Internal Affairs was being forced to revisit old cases. Lawsuits from past victims were reopened, and new witnesses were coming forward every hour. It was a full-scale collapse, and it all started with one cop who thought he was above the law. As the media hounded for statements, desperate for an interview, for a reaction, for a moment of triumph from the man who had started it all, Shaq stayed quiet. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't give a victory speech. He didn't need to. Because this was never about revenge. It was about accountability. He had fought not because his daughter had been wronged, but because this should have never happened in the first place. Savannah wasn't just a victim. She was proof. Proof that the system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. And now, that system was starting to crack. This wasn't just about Brookhaven anymore. The case had become a national conversation. Cities across the country were re-examining police conduct policies. Legal analysts were calling the ruling a precedent-setting decision. Political leaders were forced to address the issue head-on. And Grayson? He wasn't just a disgraced cop. He was a warning. A reminder that badges don't make you untouchable. That power, when abused, can be taken away just as easily as it was given. For years, he had wielded authority like a weapon, never once thinking it could be turned against him. Now, as he sat in a cold jail cell, stripped of his uniform, stripped of his power, he realized the truth. He had spent his career ruining lives. But in the end, he had ruined himself, and the world watched it happen. The trial was over. The verdict had been delivered. The country had watched a man who once abused his badge walk into a courtroom with arrogance and leave in handcuffs. For most, that would have been enough. But for Shaq, this wasn't about one case. It wasn't about one corrupt officer. It was about something bigger. So when the interview requests started flooding in, when networks scrambled to get the first exclusive, when cameras lined up outside his offices, waiting for a statement, Shaq gave them nothing, not right away. Because timing was everything. He wasn't interested in a victory lap. He wasn't interested in talking for the sake of headlines. He was waiting for the right moment. And when it finally came, the entire country stopped to listen. The set was simple. No flashing banners, no dramatic music, no distractions. Just a sleek black table, 2 chairs, and a dimly lit studio. On one side sat Anderson Hale, one of the most respected journalists in the country. A man known for pressing hard, for asking the uncomfortable questions, for never letting his guests control the conversation. On the other side sat Shaq Dorsey, a man who had controlled every single move he made since the moment his daughter was assaulted. The cameras rolled. Millions watched live. Anderson leaned forward, hands folded on the table. You stayed silent for weeks after the verdict. Why speak now? Shaq exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the armrest. Because now is when it matters. Trials don't change systems. Headlines don't change systems. But what happens after? That's where the real change begins. Anderson nodded. You took this fight all the way. You didn't just hold one officer accountable. You exposed an entire network of corruption. Was that always the plan? Shaq's eyes didn't waver. It was never about just one man. This was about everybody who let it happen. Grayson wasn't a bad apple. He was part of a system that gave him the power to do what he did. And that's what needed to be torn down. The room was still. Anderson let the words settle before he asked the next question. You're a billionaire. You could have handled this quietly, settled it behind closed doors, made the whole thing disappear. Why take the risk of making it public? Shaq leaned forward slightly, his voice steady but firm. Because my daughter isn't the only one this has happened to. The difference is, she had the privilege of proof. She had video. She had resources. Most people don't. And if we let this slide, if we let it get buried like so many cases before it, what happens to the next person who doesn't have a camera to prove what was done to them? The audience watching from home felt the weight of that. Because he was right. How many stories had never been told? How many names had never been heard? This wasn't just about Savannah. This was about everyone who had been silenced before her. Anderson turned the conversation. Savannah has become a symbol in all of this. How has she handled the attention? Shaq smiled, but there was something deeper behind it. Pride, yes, but also the understanding that his daughter had been forced into a role she never asked for. She's stronger than she knows, he said. She didn't want to be at the center of this, but she understands why it matters. And now, she's using her voice to make sure this doesn't stop with her. Savannah had already begun working with advocacy groups, meeting with lawmakers, using her platform to push for real change. She wasn't just moving forward, she was leading the charge. Anderson hesitated before asking the next question. Have you given any thought to what happens to Chadwick Grayson now? Shaq didn't flinch. I don't care about what happens to him. I care about what happens to every other officer like him. The ones who are still wearing badges. The ones who haven't been caught yet. The ones who will see this case and start thinking, maybe I'm next. There it was. That was the point. Grayson wasn't important. Grayson was just a symptom of the disease. The real story was about every system that had let men like him operate without fear. And now, that fear had finally arrived. Anderson's voice dropped slightly, knowing they were nearing the end of something powerful. If there's one message you want people to take away from all of this, what would it be? Shaq took a slow breath. Then he looked directly into the camera. Real power isn't about who carries a badge. It's about who stands in truth. The words were simple, but the impact was immediate. Within minutes, the quote was everywhere. Pinned tweets, Instagram captions, headlines. It was printed on protest signs. It was repeated in news segments. It became a statement of resistance. Because people understood the truth behind it. Power wasn't in a uniform. It wasn't in the title. It wasn't in a system that protected the wrong people. Real power was in the hands of those who refused to stay silent. In the days following the interview, change started to take root. Laws were proposed to hold officers more accountable. Departments across the country faced renewed scrutiny. Protests grew into policy discussions, and most importantly, people paid attention. For the first time in a long time, the conversation wasn't just about one bad cop. It was about all of them. And it was about the people who had the courage to stand up and say, not this time, not anymore. Shaq never wanted to be the face of a movement. But whether he liked it or not, he had just changed the game. This wasn't just a story. It was a wake-up call. How many more Graysons are still out there, hiding behind their badges? How many more Savannahs never get their justice? If you believe in accountability, truth, and exposing corruption, stay with us. Follow for more real stories that challenge power. Share this if you know the system needs to change. Comment below. What would you have done in Shaq's place? Because justice only happens when people refuse to stay silent.